see John the Baptist being regenerate in the womb. We see that he has grace in the womb. We don't actually see that with Mary. Scripture doesn't make a point of that with Mary. It makes a point of it with John the Baptist, but not with Mary. Why? Well, as Dr. White had pointed out and was quoted earlier, the gospel writers didn't have any idea of this doctrine. Now, it's fine to speculate and say, well, maybe they had an idea and they just decided not to throw it in. But again, then it makes it sound like the doctrine's not that important if they didn't decide to put it in Scripture. After all, Scripture is able to make one wise unto salvation. So why would they leave it out? Again, we're not denying that God could hide some doctrine if he wanted to, but why would he do it? Well, what about the fathers? Well, I can tell you, starting with Tertullian, Basil of Caesarea, Ambrose, Augustine, and many more, I could give you a dozen fathers who each deny the sinlessness of Mary. But the fact is, if we've got Aquinas denying the Immaculate Conception, and even while he affirms the personal sinlessness of Mary, well, it stands to reason that it really wasn't a patristic doctrine at all. So in conclusion, there's no scriptural, logical, or patristic reason to accept the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. If one's simply going to trust the Church of Rome, well, so be it. We can't stop someone from trusting, but there's no good reason for them to do so. I now stand ready for cross-examination.
Okay, thank you for that, Tur8inFan. Mr. Albrecht, you now have 5 minutes to cross-examine Tur8inFan. You may begin when you're ready.
All right, Tur8inFan, in your commentary a little while back, on the same vein, you say, and I quote, Aquinas, like the Reformed churches, regarded Mary as having been conceived with original sin. Are you of the persuasion that Thomas Aquinas held to the same view as modern-day Reformed churches in regards to Mary's conception?
To the extent that we're saying that Mary was like all other humans, conceived in original sin. Yes, there are certainly many, many other points where Aquinas is different from the Reformed churches. But on the issue of whether she was conceived in original sin, he had the same view.
I guess what I'm trying to work on is, do you believe the Reformed churches had the same view as to the way Mary was conceived and as to her being preserved from having any sin, as St. Thomas Aquinas believed? Do you believe in the same? Do you have the same view as he did on this topic?
Well, I think I was trying to be clear that as far as, so let me expand on that to be more clear. Like the Reformed churches, Aquinas believed that Mary was conceived with original sin. Now, where he differed from the Reformed churches, that's that he believed that she was purified of that before she was born, and that she was preserved from any personal sin afterwards. Now, that's different from the Reformed churches. Yeah.
Understood. That's all I was trying to work at. All right. Tur8inFan, in an older blog posting you made, you said that this teaching doesn't appear prior to the Pelagians. Do you still believe that this teaching doesn't appear before Pelagius?
I remain unaware. Of course, there are many writings that are out there, but I remain unaware of prior teachings in the church on that denied that Mary had original sin. Now, the Pelagians denied that anyone had original sin, and they denied that Mary did as well.
Have you studied at any length the ancient Christian prayer towards Mary, the Sub Tuum Praesidium?
Well, some of these ancient prayers, and I can't recall whether that's one of the ones that I've looked at, but many of these have an evolving. There's an extent to which they evolve. So I haven't, for example, heard of any cases where Augustine made reference to such a prayer.
I don't believe Augustine would have needed to make mention to it, but I guess I was asking if you're aware of the Sub Tuum Praesidium because I wanted to ask you if you're aware of what the final verse reads in the Greek. But if you haven't examined it, it wouldn't really be responsible to ask you that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I would think it would be valuable to examine that type of thing historically, find out what development it underwent and what records we have of it. And typically one would do that through looking at writings that existed at the time that it's alleged to have been written.
Are you aware that the Sub Tuum Praesidium was a widespread prayer in the early 200s in the Coptic Church, and it was actually used in the liturgy of the church?
I would welcome your demonstration of that sort of thing.
Okay. Are you aware? I have another question. Are you aware of the Are you of the persuasion that pas in its Greek usage is used to mean all when we find it in the Bible, or even in the surrounding literature?
Normally, the word is translated all, and like the English all, sometimes it has various shades of meaning. So we sometimes joke around with folks that all means all, but of course then the question is, what is the all referring to? So.
Great. Okay. I guess my next question would be, you made a comment earlier that Mary viewed Jesus as crazy, and I believe you brought up Mark 3:21. Are you aware of the New American Standard Version's rendering of this passage?
I have a copy of it, if that's what you mean.
Okay. Are you of the persuasion that this is speaking of his family, and indeed his mother is included in this verse?
Well, I think what makes it clear that his mother and brethren are included is verse 31, which says, "There came then his mother and his brethren and his mother, and standing without sent unto him, calling him."
Okay, so you would contend that 21 and 31 are connected, even though verse 21 tells us, and when his own people heard this, and even though it's I guess my question would be, you would connect them, even though verse 21 reads differently than verse 31.
Yes, I would say that who the own people are, or who the friends are, or who the family are, depending on which translation you use. The people of his house, I think, is another translation that's out there. That those are explained with more particularity in verse 31.
Okay, great. I have no further questions.
Okay, Mr. Albrecht, you now have 6 minutes for your first affirmative rebuttal. You may begin when you're ready.
Today's debate has brought forth a number of interesting proposals. Protestantism attempts to use the scriptures in the Bible to show that Mary sinned. But indeed, even the fathers that speak of the faults within Mary surely don't tell us that Mary was a sinner, or call her a sinner. Instead, they taught that Mary was sinless. But some said that her sinlessness began when she was born instead of at her conception. If we examine the early church, we find a significant number of very important details. Justin Martyr is clear in the Mary-Eve antithesis. The same can be said of Irenaeus. Origen is even clearer when he tells us that the Virgin Mother of the only begotten of God is called Mary, worthy of God. He calls her Immaculate of the Immaculate. Hippolytus tells us that Jesus was the ark formed of incorruptible wood. He then tells us, for by this signify that his tabernacle, Mary, was exempt from defilement and corruption. Ephraim the Syrian tells us that you alone and your mother are more beautiful than any others, for there is neither blemish in you or any stains upon your mother. Ambrose tells us that God made Mary free of every single stain of sin. Gregory of Nazianzo says that Mary had been first purified by the Spirit in soul and body. Theodotus and Proclus explain Mary was spotless from sin and had no stain of sin. The patristic proof attestation to this belief is astounding. It becomes all the more magnified when we reach Protestant reformer Martin Luther. As we can see in the early stages of Protestantism, even Martin Luther believed in the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. Later on down the line, it's been argued that he changed his views, but there are indeed numerous Lutheran scholars that state to the contrary. So we see again in Protestantism an evolution of theological beliefs and a shift away from the traditional approach of the early church. Today it's nearly impossible to find a Protestant that would hold to this view in Mary. As Protestantism slowly evolves, it meticulously moves away from the ancient Christian faith, gaining a new number of new teachings and abandoning the ancient traditional ones along the way. Indeed, Orthodox theologian John Meyendorff tells us, quotations can easily be multiplied, and they give clear indications that the Mariological piety of the Byzantines would probably have led them to accept the definition of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception of Mary as it was defined by the Pope, if only they shared the Western doctrine of original sin. So is it damaging when we hear that only Christ is without sin? Absolutely not. We have to be clear in this distinction between Christ, who by his nature has never had any vestiges of sin, and between Mary, who was sinless because God saved her by giving her the graces necessary to overcome the devil's grasp. As Genesis explains, she was, as Christ, the enemy of Satan and his grasp. In the early Christian church, the majority of the arguments were not about whether Mary sinned or not, or whether she was holy or not, but rather on her conception and her birth. Earlier, we saw how Tur8inFan believed that the earliest reference to such a belief could be found in the Pelagians. But surely Tur8inFan has done little homework on this topic, or he would have been aware of the Subtuum Presidium and its wide usage in the early church. Indeed, where it's not explicit, the earliest prayer to Mary that we're aware of, the Subtuum, calls Mary only pure. Such a prayer was never labeled heretical